Jamal West, a black man, found himself in an unexpected and unfair situation when two police officers, Riley and Jenkins, approached him. What seemed like a normal encounter quickly spiraled into something else entirely. But the real shock came later, when the officers and the entire station realized they were dealing with much more than just a wrongful arrest. The revelation about who Jamal truly was left everyone speechless, leading to not just a legal case, but a reckoning that none of them saw coming. It was a typical busy morning in the heart of the city. The sun had just started to rise, casting long shadows over the tall buildings and filling the streets with life. The sounds of car horns, distant sirens, and people talking created a familiar city buzz. People were beginning their day, hurrying to work, grabbing their morning coffee, or walking their dogs. The neighborhood was vibrant and full of energy. Amidst the crowd was Jamal West, walking calmly in sharp contrast to the rush around him. In his mid-30s, he was dressed in a well-fitted, stylish suit. The polished click of his shoes echoed against the pavement, drawing subtle attention to him as he passed by. With a warm smile, he adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt. He didn't seek attention, but his quiet confidence naturally turned heads. Jamal had that effect on people. He had just finished having breakfast at his favorite local diner, a spot he often visited when he had the time. The staff knew him by name and made sure his order was always perfect: scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and a side of fresh fruit. As he walked towards a sleek, black sedan parked on the street, he felt his phone buzz in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from his mom, a gentle reminder about their dinner plans that night. Smiling, Jamal quickly replied, reassuring her that he hadn't forgotten and was looking forward to it. Family was everything to him. Just as he was about to unlock his car, he noticed two police officers approaching him. Their eyes were locked on him, and their faces were set in unreadable expressions. Jamal didn't recognize them, but that wasn't out of the ordinary. New officers often rotated through the neighborhood. However, something about the way they were staring at him felt different. There was an intensity in their gaze that made his instincts sharpen. Growing up, Jamal had learned how to handle himself around police, especially as a black man. His father had taught him from a young age to always stay calm, remain respectful, and never give them a reason to escalate any situation. Those lessons were deeply ingrained in his mind. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out as they neared him. Jamal stopped in his tracks, still holding his phone in one hand, and turned to face them. His expression remained calm and collected. "Yes, officer?" Jamal responded politely. His eyes flicked to the officer's badge. It read Riley. The other officer, Jenkins, stood slightly behind Riley, his hand resting on his belt, close to his holster. "Can I see some ID?" Riley's voice was sharp and almost commanding. There was no friendly greeting, no explanation for why they had stopped him. Jamal had been through situations like this before, but this time felt different. There was a tense energy in the air that set off alarm bells in his mind. "May I ask why?" Jamal inquired, keeping his voice steady. He didn't want to provoke the situation, but he knew his rights. He had done nothing wrong, and there was no clear reason for the officers to ask for his identification. Riley's eyes narrowed slightly, a smug expression creeping onto his face. "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." His tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. It was a demand. Jamal met the officer's gaze for a brief moment, then slowly reached into his jacket pocket. "All right," he said calmly, pulling out his wallet. "But I'd still like to know why you're asking for it." He handed over his driver's license, keeping a close eye on the officers. As Riley took the ID and looked it over, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Jenkins, who had been standing quietly, shifted his position ever so slightly, as if getting ready for something. Jamal's senses were now on high alert, but he maintained his composure. Riley's face remained impassive as he looked at the ID, giving nothing away. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Jamal's brow furrowed in slight confusion. "I'm just heading to my car," he answered truthfully. "Is there a problem?" Riley ignored the question, his tone becoming more accusatory. "Where are you coming from?" Jamal, still puzzled by the officer's attitude, responded, "I had breakfast at the diner." He gestured toward the local spot down the street. Despite Jamal's calm and respectful answers, it was clear Riley and Jenkins had already made up their minds about him. As Jamal stood there, he repeated calmly, "Like I said, I just had breakfast. Is there a problem, officer?" Riley's eyes flicked back to meet his, a flicker of something, maybe annoyance, crossed his face before he handed the ID back to Jamal. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Riley said, his smirk returning. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." Jamal's stomach tightened. He knew exactly where this was heading. It was a story he had lived through before. A black man in a nice neighborhood, well-dressed, must be up to no good. It was an all-too-familiar narrative, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "I see," Jamal said carefully, maintaining his calm. "Well, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. I'm just trying to get to my car and head to work." He gestured to his vehicle, hoping to defuse the situation. Riley, however, wasn't backing down. He took a step closer, his posture becoming more aggressive. "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a lawyer," Jamal replied, keeping his voice even. "I have a meeting in about an hour, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to get going." That answer seemed to catch Riley off guard for a moment. His smirk faded, but only for a brief second before returning. "A lawyer, huh? You don't say." Riley didn't seem convinced. Jenkins, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "You sure you're not hiding anything? Got anything illegal in that car of yours?" Jamal could feel the tension in the air growing. He knew how situations like this could spiral out of control if he wasn't careful. Staying calm was his only option. "There's nothing illegal in my car, officer. You're welcome to check, but I prefer if you didn't waste your time. I'm just trying to get to work." Riley's expression hardened. "You don't get to decide how we do our job. Step away from the car." Jamal hesitated for a second. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the situation was quickly turning dangerous. He had to choose. Comply and hope it wouldn't escalate further, or stand his ground and risk making things worse. His father's words echoed in his mind, reminding him to stay calm, to be smart. "All right," Jamal said slowly, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "I'll step back." He took a step away from the car, watching as Riley moved closer, his hand now resting on the handle of his baton. Jamal's heart began to race, but he forced himself to keep his face neutral. He couldn't show them any fear. Without warning, Riley grabbed Jamal's arm and twisted it behind his back. The move was so sudden that it caught Jamal off guard, and he winced in pain. Before he could react, Jenkins was on him as well, forcing him to the ground. "Hey, what are you doing?" Jamal protested, struggling to keep his voice calm despite the pain shooting through his shoulder. He wasn't resisting, but they were treating him like a criminal. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Riley said coldly, tightening the handcuffs around Jamal's wrists. Jamal's mind raced. Resisting arrest? He hadn't resisted at all. He had done everything they asked, tried to reason with them, tried to stay calm. But it didn't matter. They had made up their minds about him the moment they saw him. By now, the commotion had caught the attention of people nearby. An elderly woman named Agnes Carter, who lived in an apartment across the street, watched in horror from her balcony. She knew Jamal, had seen him many times in the neighborhood. He wasn't a troublemaker. "What are you doing to him?" Mrs. Carter called out, her voice shaking with outrage. "He didn't do anything wrong." A young couple walking their dog had also stopped to watch. The man pulled out his phone and began recording the scene. "This is messed up," he muttered to his girlfriend. "They're arresting him for nothing." Jamal noticed the phone recording and felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe the footage would help him later. Maybe it would show the truth of what had happened. But for now, he was helpless, as the officers roughly pulled him to his feet. He focused on staying calm. He knew that anything he said now could be used against him later. His father's lessons about keeping his head cool in moments like this rang in his ears. He couldn't afford to let anger or fear slip out, no matter how unfair it was. As they led him toward the police car, the crowd around them began to grow. More people were stopping to watch, some recording with their phones, others shouting in frustration at what they were witnessing. "This isn't right," a man yelled from across the street. He didn't do anything, but Riley and Jenkins paid no attention to the crowd. They kept their focus on Jamal, their faces set with cold determination. They didn't care about the growing number of witnesses or about the outcries of injustice. Jamal was roughly pushed into the back of the squad car, the doors slamming shut with force. He glanced out the window at the growing crowd outside, their faces filled with concern, anger, and confusion. They knew something was wrong, and so did he. Taking a deep breath, Jamal realized he needed to say something, anything, to let them know this wasn't the end. "This isn't over," he called out, his voice carrying through the thin glass of the car window. "This isn't over." The words echoed as the car pulled away, leaving the stunned crowd behind, many still recording and talking amongst themselves. Inside the squad car, Jamal's mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about what was happening, how he was going to fight this, and how he would make sure justice was served. He wasn't going to let this slide. He was innocent, and the truth would come out one way or another. When they arrived at the police station, the atmosphere was immediately different from the vibrant streets outside. The cold, gray walls and harsh fluorescent lights created a stark contrast. Officers moved quickly, some chatting, others focused on their work, but the station felt tense. It was the kind of tension where people spoke in hushed tones and exchanged uncertain glances. Jamal was led into the station with his hands still cuffed behind his back. Riley and Jenkins flanked him, their expressions unreadable as they passed through the busy booking area. A few officers looked up, narrowing their eyes as they took in Jamal's appearance. He wasn't the usual type they brought in, a well-dressed black man with a calm, composed demeanor. He stood out in this setting, and they noticed. "Over here," Riley barked, guiding Jamal toward a desk where a tired-looking officer sat behind a computer. The officer barely looked up from his screen, seemingly uninterested. "Name?" the officer asked, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Jamal West." Riley answered before Jamal could speak for himself. The officer typed the name into the system, his eyes scanning the screen. A slight frown creased his brow, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he gestured toward the fingerprinting station. "Let's get this over with." Riley grunted in agreement and pushed Jamal forward. Jamal didn't resist. He had learned long ago not to give them any reason to make things worse. As they took his fingerprints, he stayed silent, though his mind was swirling with thoughts. How was this happening? He hadn't done anything wrong. Yet here he was being processed like a criminal. But he knew he had to stay calm. His composure was his best defense in this moment. Once they finished fingerprinting, Riley and Jenkins led Jamal to a small holding cell at the back of the station. It was a cramped, dingy space with a narrow bench against one wall and a metal toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, mixed with something sour and unpleasant. They removed his handcuffs and shoved him inside the cell. "Make yourself comfortable," Jenkins sneered, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "You might be here for a while." Jamal sat down on the bench, exhaling slowly. He didn't rise to their taunts. There was no point in giving them what they wanted, a reaction. They were trying to provoke him, but he wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. He remained silent, knowing his strength lay in keeping his cool. As Riley and Jenkins walked away, they exchanged a glance. A silent understanding passed between them. Another arrest, another so-called troublemaker brought in. They had done their job, and now they could move on to whatever was next. But something gnawed at Riley, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. The arrest hadn't gone as smoothly as he had expected. There was something about Jamal, the way he carried himself, that made Riley uneasy. Jamal's calmness, his quiet confidence. It didn't match the profile of the people they usually picked up. Riley had been doing this long enough to know when something didn't sit right. Thinks he's a lawyer, huh? Jenkins scoffed as they made their way back to the front desk. Probably just another punk in a fancy suit. Yeah, Riley muttered, though his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't so sure anymore. Something about Jamal felt off, and he couldn't figure out what it was. Was he really just another guy in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was there more to this than met the eye? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling. It didn't matter. They had followed their orders, and that was all there was to it. They had done what they were supposed to do. Just as they reached the desk, a young officer who had been sitting quietly at a nearby station suddenly stood up. His face was pale, and he seemed hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he should speak. Something about his demeanor caught Riley's attention. Sirs," the young officer said nervously, his voice wavering slightly. "I think there's something you need to see." Riley and Jenkins exchanged confused glances before walking over to the young officer's desk. What could this rookie possibly have that was important enough to stop them? The officer turned his monitor slightly so they could see, and what was on the screen made Riley's unease grow even stronger. There, flashing on the screen, was Jamal West's name, and right next to it, a title that neither Riley nor Jenkins had been expecting to see. This wasn't just any arrest. Officer Stevens, who had been quietly observing the situation, finally stepped forward. Though relatively new to the department, having joined just a few months earlier, Stevens had already earned a reputation for being smart, smarter than most gave him credit for. He was eager to prove himself, but more than that, he had a sense of justice that went beyond simply following orders. "Hey, Riley," Stevens called out softly, making sure his voice didn't carry too far. He waited for Riley to turn toward him, the frown on the senior officer's face deepening. "What is it?" Riley replied, irritation clear in his tone. Stevens hesitated, looking around to ensure no one else was listening. He stepped closer, his voice dropping even lower. "That guy you just brought in, Jamal West." "I think I know who he is," Stevens said, his voice almost a whisper. Riley's frown turned into a scowl of confusion. "What are you talking about?" Stevens leaned in even closer, as if sharing a secret he wasn't sure he should reveal. "I saw him in a news article a few weeks ago. He's not just some lawyer. He's a civil rights attorney. A pretty big deal. Actually, he's been involved in high-profile cases, major ones." For the first time, Riley's eyes widened, though he quickly masked his surprise, trying to maintain his composed demeanor. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Stevens said firmly. "I didn't recognize him at first, but when I heard the name, it all clicked. You might want to be careful with this one. If he's who I think he is, this could blow up in our faces." Riley didn't respond right away. He felt a knot form in his stomach, a doubt gnawing at him. Could it really be true? Could they have arrested someone of Jamal's caliber without knowing? No! He pushed the thought aside. They had arrested him fair and square. There was no way Jamal West was important enough to cause any real trouble. But still, that nagging doubt lingered, unsettling him. "I'll handle it," Riley said curtly, brushing Stevens off with a dismissive wave. But as he walked away, the uneasy feeling remained, refusing to leave his mind. Stevens watched Riley's retreating form, unsure if he had made the right call by speaking up. With a sigh, he pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he scrolled through his contacts. He knew the situation was bigger than what it seemed. He found the number he needed and dialed it, praying he wasn't making a mistake. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah, Captain, it's Stevens," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've got a situation at the station, and I think you need to know about it." Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Jamal sat calmly on the bench, his mind laser-focused. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about something larger. He was certain he had been targeted, but the question of why still hung in the air. Yet, even with the uncertainty, he refused to let fear take hold. He had faced worse situations before, and he would get through this one, too. An hour passed in silence. Finally, the door to the holding area swung open, and a woman entered. She was in her late 30s, her sharp eyes scanning the room with an authority that made everyone sit up a little straighter. This was Lieutenant Kate Thompson. She was relatively new to the station, having transferred just a few weeks ago, but she had already made it clear that she wasn't to be underestimated. Thompson's gaze swept over the bustling room. She quickly spotted Riley and Jenkins at the front desk, talking in hushed tones. Something about their posture caught her attention. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something was off. "Riley, Jenkins," Thompson called out as she strode over to them. Her voice carried a weight that immediately made them stop their conversation and look up, surprised. "Nothing much, ma'am," Riley said, his tone casual. "Just another day on the job." Thompson narrowed her eyes, clearly not buying his casual demeanor. "Really? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning. A man named Jamal West." Riley stiffened at the mention of the name, but quickly recovered his composure. "Yes, ma'am, we did." "And what was the charge?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through any potential dishonesty. "Resisting arrest," Riley replied, his tone steady. "We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Did he now?" Riley nodded, his expression unwavering. "Yes, ma'am." Thompson didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied Riley's face, her eyes searching for any hint that he might be bending the truth. She had dealt with officers like him before, those who thought they could bend the rules to suit their needs. But she wasn't one of them. She had come up through the ranks by playing things by the book, and she expected her team to do the same. "Take me to him," she said finally, her voice leaving no room for argument. Riley hesitated for a split second before nodding. "Right this way, ma'am." As they walked toward the holding cells, Thompson's instincts screamed that there was more to this than what Riley was letting on. Something didn't add up. Stopped and turned to face Riley and Jenkins, her expression stern, and no longer hiding her growing frustration. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice calm but firm. "Do you two have any idea who you just arrested?" Thompson asked, her tone leaving no room for evasion. Riley shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Jenkins as if hoping for support, but Jenkins offered none. "He resisted arrest," Riley muttered defensively. "We had reason to suspect him." Thompson's eyes narrowed, cutting Riley off before he could say more. "A gut feeling isn't enough, Riley. We're not in the business of arresting people based on hunches, especially someone like Jamal West." Jenkins looked confused, while Riley's discomfort grew. "What do you mean, someone like him?" Jenkins asked, clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation. "Jamal West is not just some lawyer," Thompson explained, her voice now laced with urgency. "He's a high-profile civil rights attorney. He's taken on cases that make headlines, involving police misconduct, corporate corruption, and government overreach. If word gets out that we arrested him without just cause, the backlash could be enormous, not just for us, but for the entire department." Jenkins' face paled as the weight of Thompson's words sank in. Riley, still trying to process the situation, swallowed hard but couldn't come up with a response. Thompson continued, not waiting for them to speak. "I've just seen his profile. This man has the power and the influence to turn this entire station upside down. If we don't handle this carefully, we'll be facing more than just internal investigations. We could be dealing with lawsuits, protests, media coverage, things that could ruin our careers and the department's reputation." Riley's face tightened, a mix of regret and fear creeping into his expression. "Ma'am, I didn't realize," he stammered, his confidence faltering. "Well, now you do," Thompson snapped. "And we need to fix this fast." Jenkins, finally grasping the severity of the situation, spoke up. "What do we do now, Lieutenant?" Thompson took a moment to think, her mind racing through the possibilities. "First, we need to get our story straight. We'll release him immediately, but we'll do it by the book. No excuses, no lies. We admit there was a misunderstanding, we apologize, and we make sure this doesn't blow up any further than it already has." She glanced between the two officers, making sure her message was clear. "You two are going to handle this. You brought him in. So you're going to be the ones to apologize and explain the situation. But I'll be overseeing everything. We're not taking any chances here." Riley nodded quickly, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, realizing how much damage had already been done. Jenkins, still looking shaken, also nodded. "Understood, ma'am." Thompson motioned for them to follow her back toward the holding cell, her every step filled with purpose. They had made a critical mistake, and now they had to make things right before it spiraled out of control any further. When they reached the cell, Jamal was still seated, calm and composed, though his eyes flicked to them with a knowing look. He had sensed the tension growing and likely understood that things were shifting in his favor. Thompson opened the cell door, motioning for Riley and Jenkins to follow her inside. "Mr. West," Thompson began, her tone measured and professional. "After further review of the situation, it's clear that there was a misunderstanding. You are free to go." Jamal's eyes shifted from Thompson to the two officers behind her. He didn't move, waiting for more, knowing this wasn't over yet. Riley stepped forward, his voice strained but sincere. "Mr. West, we're sorry for the way things unfolded. We were operating under suspicion, but it's clear now that we made a mistake." Jenkins, looking equally uncomfortable, echoed Riley's words. "We apologize, sir. It wasn't our intention to cause you any harm." Jamal studied their faces for a moment before standing up. He said nothing, but the quiet power in his presence filled the room. He didn't need to say much. His composure said it all. Thompson took a deep breath, knowing that while this immediate situation was being resolved, the ripple effects were just beginning. "If there's anything further you need from us, Mr. West, please let us know. We want to ensure this mistake is corrected properly." Jamal nodded slowly, his voice steady and calm. "I'll make sure you hear from my legal team." He didn't raise his voice or show anger, but the message was clear. This wasn't the end. As Jamal walked out of the station, Thompson, Riley, and Jenkins watched him go, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. There was no undoing the arrest, but they knew now that they had crossed paths with someone who wouldn't let this incident fade quietly. Lieutenant Thompson rounded on Riley and Jenkins, her expression fierce and her voice sharp but controlled. "Do you have any idea who you've just arrested?" she demanded, keeping her tone low but brimming with intensity. "Jamal West isn't some random guy off the street. He's a civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on cases of police misconduct. If he decides to file a lawsuit against us, we're all going to be in serious trouble." Riley's face paled, his bravado slipping away as the weight of Thompson's words sank in. "Ma'am, we didn't know." "He didn't mention anything about being a lawyer," he stammered, trying to defend his actions. "It doesn't matter," Thompson snapped. "You should have done your due diligence before bringing him in. Now we need to figure out how to handle this, and fast." As she spoke, the sound of raised voices from outside the station began to filter through the walls. Thompson's head snapped up, her heart sinking as she realized what was happening. The crowd outside was growing, and they were getting louder. The unmistakable chants of protesters demanding justice and Jamal's release filled the air. "Great," Thompson muttered under her breath, frustration and anxiety mingling. "Just what we needed." Officer Stevens, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. "Lieutenant, the community is already fired up about this. We've got activists, local leaders, and even some media starting to show up. If we don't do something soon, this could turn into a full-blown crisis." Thompson knew he was right. She had seen situations like this spiral out of control before, small incidents that turned into major events because they weren't handled correctly. But this was different. This wasn't just about calming a tense situation. It was about protecting the integrity of the police force and avoiding a massive legal and public relations disaster. "We need to get ahead of this," Thompson said decisively, her mind racing. "Riley, Jenkins, I want a full report on the arrest. I need every detail on the steps you took and why. I don't care how long it takes. Just get it done. Stevens, I need you to help me figure out how we handle the press. We need to control the narrative before it spins out of control. As the officers scattered to carry out her orders, Thompson felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had only been at the station for a few weeks, and already she was facing a potential disaster. But she wasn't about to let this ruin her career or tarnish the department's reputation. Inside the holding cell, Jamal sat quietly, his mind racing as he listened to the commotion outside. The crowd's voices were growing louder, echoing through the station walls. He knew his family was likely among them, along with community leaders and activists who had always supported him. They wouldn't let this go unanswered. A flicker of hope sparked in Jamal's chest as he realized the community was rallying behind him, but he knew better than to relax just yet. The police still controlled the situation, and he had seen how they could twist events to their advantage. He wasn't about to underestimate their ability to manipulate the narrative. Back at the front of the station, the tension continued to mount. The crowd outside had swelled to over 100 people, many holding signs and banners demanding justice for Jamal. Reporters had arrived, their cameras trained on the growing crowd, capturing every moment for the evening news. The police station was quickly becoming the epicenter of a larger movement, a symbol of the community's deepening unrest. Lieutenant Thompson stood by the station's front window, her jaw clenched as she watched the scene unfold. The chants of the crowd echoed in her ears, each cry for justice adding to the pressure building inside her. She knew she had to act, but she was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and everything could explode. But if she did nothing, the situation would spiral out of control on its own. She turned to Stevens, who stood beside her, looking just as concerned. "We need to release him," she said finally, her voice tight with resolve. "It's the only way to de-escalate this before it gets out of hand." Stevens nodded in agreement, but he frowned slightly. How are we going to explain this to the media? They're not just going to accept that we let him go without a clear reason. Thompson thought for a moment, weighing her options. "We frame it as a misunderstanding," she said finally. "We'll say that after reviewing the evidence, we determined there was no basis for the arrest and decided to release him. We'll emphasize that we take these matters seriously and that we're committed to justice and fairness." Stevens nodded, though both of them knew it wasn't a perfect solution. The media and the community weren't going to be satisfied with a vague explanation, but it was the best they had for now, and it might just be enough to prevent a full-blown crisis. Thompson was prepared to face the consequences of the fallout, but she wasn't ready to let the situation escalate into something that could tear the entire department apart. As Thompson and Stevens moved to execute their plan, the weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. Jamal's fate and the future of the station hung in the balance, feeling of unease still gnawing at her. The situation had been managed for the time being, but she knew all too well that it was far from over. Jamal West wasn't someone who would simply move on, and the growing presence of the media, the community, and the public eye meant that this incident would cast a long shadow over the department. For now, the station was quiet, but Thompson could feel the undercurrent of tension. Officers were keeping to themselves, nervously aware that today's events were the start of something bigger. There were no immediate crises, but the real fallout would come later. Once the lawyers, reporters, and community leaders got involved, the ripple effects would be felt for a long time, not just in the station, but in the entire town. Thompson sighed, rubbing her temples. She knew her next steps would be critical. She had to ensure that every aspect of the arrest was reviewed, every mistake owned up to, and every bit of damage control handled with precision. The reputation of the station and her own career depended on it. But it wasn't just about the police department anymore. It was about the community's trust, something that had already been fragile before today. As she sifted through the reports from Riley and Jenkins, Thompson's frustration grew. The details were sloppy, filled with assumptions and vague justifications. It was clear they had acted on instinct and bias, rather than on any concrete evidence or probable cause. And now, they were paying the price for it. She would have to hold them accountable, not only for their actions, but for the broader impact this had on the entire force. She couldn't help but think of Jamal West, the calm way he had handled himself, his quiet composure as he walked out of the station, knowing that his next move would be a legal and public reckoning. Thompson respected that about him. He wasn't rattled, even in the face of injustice. He knew his rights, and more importantly, he knew how to leverage the situation to bring about real change. Thompson's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Captain Harris, requesting an update on the situation. She knew she had to brief him on everything that had happened, including the looming threat of a lawsuit and potential media fallout. But even more than that, she needed to explain what steps she was taking to prevent this from spiraling further. After sending a quick response to the captain, she stood up and walked over to the window, watching the last few stragglers from the crowd outside slowly disperse. Jamal's release had calmed the immediate situation, but this story wasn't over. The community was watching, and they weren't going to let the department forget this incident anytime soon. In her gut, Thompson knew Jamal's case would become a turning point, not just for the police department, but for the entire town. The fact that a civil rights attorney had been wrongfully arrested was a flashpoint that would ignite conversations about race, justice, and accountability. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. This was a mess, no doubt about it. But if she played her cards right, maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this into something constructive. The department could learn from this, grow from it, and perhaps rebuild some of the trust that had been eroded over the years. But first, she had to make sure that Riley and Jenkins understood the gravity of their actions. They needed to be held accountable, and not just with a slap on the wrist. Real consequences needed to follow, or the department would risk losing whatever credibility it had left. Thompson returned to her desk, picking up the reports again. She would need to go through every detail, line by line, and ensure there was no room for ambiguity. This wasn't just about fixing today's mess. It was about preventing future ones. As the sun began to set and the station settled into an uneasy calm, Thompson knew that the real work had only just begun. For Jamal, for the department, and for the community, the battle for justice was far from over, and she was ready to face it head-on. Investigator working undercover, Thompson finished, her voice heavy with the weight of her revelation. The silence in the room was suffocating as the reality of her words sank in. Riley's face paled, and Jenkins, normally quick to respond, seemed frozen in place. Neither of them had anticipated that the man they'd arrested was not only a powerful civil rights attorney, but also involved in a federal investigation that could threaten their entire department. Undercover? Riley finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We had no idea." "Exactly," Thompson said, her tone sharp. "You had no idea. And because of your recklessness, you've jeopardized not only your careers but this entire department. Jamal West wasn't just some guy you picked up for no reason. He's gathering evidence on law enforcement corruption. He's been working with the feds to expose systemic racism in police departments. And you two walked right into it." Jenkins' hands clenched into fists, his face flushing with a mix of anger and fear. "We didn't know," he repeated defensively, though his voice lacked conviction. "That doesn't matter now," Thompson snapped. "What matters is that you've given him exactly what he needed to blow this entire department wide open. You think this is just going to go away? You think this can be fixed with a simple apology? No! This is bigger than any of us, and if we don't handle it properly, we're all going down with it." She could see the panic rising in both officers as the gravity of the situation fully hit them. They had unknowingly arrested a man whose legal expertise and federal connections could dismantle everything they'd worked for. And now, it was too late to undo the damage. Riley tried to regain his composure. "What do we do now, Lieutenant?" Thompson took a deep breath, trying to steady her own nerves. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew they had to act fast. "First, we're going to make sure this doesn't escalate any further. I've already called in some favors, and we're going to get a full legal review before anything else goes public. The last thing we need is for this to hit the media without a plan in place. Jenkins shook his head, disbelief still clouding his expression. But how could we have known? He didn't give any indication of who he was. Thompson's eyes flashed with frustration. That's the whole point, Jenkins. He didn't need to. He's playing a bigger game, and you two just became pawns in it. Now, the best thing we can do is limit the fallout. Riley ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. This could destroy us. Thompson's gaze hardened. It very well could, but we're going to do everything we can to mitigate the damage. I'm going to contact the legal team and the higher-ups. We need to get ahead of this and start crafting a strategy. She turned away from the two officers, her mind racing with the steps that needed to be taken. Damage control, legal briefings, internal reviews. There was so much to be done, and all of it had to happen quickly before the situation exploded in their faces. As she reached for the door, Jenkins spoke up, his voice tinged with desperation. "Lieutenant, do you think we'll lose our jobs over this?" Thompson paused, her hand on the door handle, before turning back to face them. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice softening slightly. "But I do know this. You're not going to lose them without a fight. Now get back to your reports. We have a lot of work ahead of us." She left the room, her mind still swirling with thoughts. She knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. Jamal West was more than just a lawyer. He was a man on a mission, and she could feel the weight of that mission pressing down on her shoulders. If they didn't handle this perfectly, their department would be in ruins, and the truth of their failure would be laid bare for the world to see. But for now, there was only one option. Move forward, be smart, and hope that it wasn't already too late to salvage what was left of the situation. Thompson had always believed in doing things by the book, but now she realized that this was bigger than any book she'd ever read. Wildfire, igniting conversations across the city. The story was on every major news channel, and it seemed like every corner of the community was buzzing with outrage. The wrongful arrest of a prominent civil rights attorney had struck a nerve, and now the entire department was under a microscope. Lieutenant Thompson sat back down in her office, her mind racing with the weight of the federal agent's words. Jamal West wasn't just any lawyer. He was at the center of an undercover operation that could topple the very system she worked for. The federal government had its eyes on them now, and any further mistakes could lead to more than just public outcry. It could lead to careers being destroyed and an entire department falling apart. Chief Daniels, still fuming from the meeting with Agent Williams, paced back and forth in the hallway outside. His face was tight with anger, but beneath that anger was fear. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that when the federal government issued warnings like the one they had just received, it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a clear sign that their department was under the strictest scrutiny, and any misstep could be catastrophic. Thompson knew she had no choice but to take charge. She couldn't allow the situation to get any worse, but the road ahead felt treacherous. There was no room for error. Her next steps would determine whether the department could weather the storm or be dragged down by it. As the afternoon wore on, Thompson gathered her team in the briefing room. Riley and Jenkins sat in the back, their faces pale and tense, knowing they were the ones who had lit the fuse on this disaster. Other officers shuffled in, murmuring amongst themselves. The air was thick with uncertainty. Thompson stood at the front of the room, her expression firm. As many of you know by now, we are in the midst of a serious situation. The wrongful arrest of Jamal West has brought our department into the spotlight, and not in a good way. This isn't just about one mistake. This is about how we handle this moving forward. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. We are now under federal scrutiny, and we have no choice but to fully cooperate. Agent Williams has made it clear that any further missteps will have severe consequences. This department's reputation, and quite possibly its future, is on the line. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some nodding in understanding while others stared blankly ahead, still grappling with the gravity of the situation. We are going to issue a formal apology to Jamal West, Thompson continued, and I will oversee it personally. There will be no room for mistakes or hesitation. We need to show that we are taking responsibility, and we need to do it swiftly. Riley, who had been quietly watching from the back, finally spoke up. "Lieutenant, He stopped, unsure of how to proceed. His voice, usually full of bravado, was now strained with regret. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Thompson's gaze hardened. "That's exactly the problem, Riley. You didn't know. You acted without thinking, and now we're all paying the price. But this isn't just about you. It's about every officer in this room. We are all accountable for what happens next." Jenkins, sitting next to Riley, looked down at his hands, the weight of their actions pressing down on him. The realization of how deeply they had miscalculated was hitting him harder than he ever imagined. Thompson turned back to the room. "From this moment on, we will be conducting ourselves with the highest level of professionalism and caution. Every decision we make will be scrutinized, not just by the public, but by federal agents. We have earned back the trust we've lost today, and that starts now." As the briefing ended and officers began to file out, the station remained tense. There was no escaping the storm that had been unleashed, and everyone knew it. The news of Jamal West's arrest continued to spread, with reporters camping outside the station and local leaders demanding accountability. Thompson returned to her office, trying to steady her thoughts. She knew that an apology wouldn't be enough to fix this mess, but it was the first step. As she prepared for the formal apology to Jamal West, she couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Would the department survive the scandal? Would her career be able to withstand the fallout? One thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The truth was out there, and with Jamal West's case now in the public eye, it would only be a matter of time before the full extent of the corruption within the police department was exposed. For Thompson, the road ahead was unclear, but she knew one thing. There was no turning back now. The department would either rise to meet the challenge or crumble under the weight of its own mistakes. And she was determined to do everything in her power to make sure it didn't fall apart. Change. We need more than just promises. We need actions that will transform this department and how it serves the community. No more cover-ups, no more excuses. Just justice, transparency, and accountability. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, their energy shifting as they responded to Jamal's words. His calm but powerful tone had cut through the tension, and now the protesters felt they had a voice on their side. Someone who understood their demands and was willing to lead the fight for change. Chief Daniels stood silently beside Jamal, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew that the battle for real reform was just beginning. The department had failed its community for years, and this public reckoning was a long time coming. Jamal West wasn't just calling for the removal of a few bad officers. He was demanding systemic change, a complete overhaul of how the police interacted with the people they were meant to protect. Jamal turned back to the chief, meeting his gaze. "Chief Daniels, I want to make it clear that this isn't just about today's arrest. This is about the long history of misconduct, corruption, and racial profiling that has gone unchecked in this city. Your department needs to face those issues head-on, and that's going to take more than an investigation. It's going to take a partnership with this community, with activists, and with independent oversight. Are you ready for that?" Daniels nodded, though his face was tight with emotion. "I am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then louder, "I am committed to it. I give you my word, and I give this community my word. Things will change. This department will be held accountable." Jamal stepped back, allowing Daniels to return to the podium, but the chief didn't immediately address the crowd again. Instead, he took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, understanding that everything he said from this point on had to be more than just rhetoric. It had to be the foundation of a new chapter for the department. "We will not only address what happened today," Daniels continued, his voice regaining strength, "but we will confront the deeper issues within this department. I pledge to work alongside Mr. West and other community leaders to ensure that we identify and eliminate the practices that have led to this mistrust. We will not sweep this under the rug. We will face it." The crowd seemed to be cautiously optimistic, with a few scattered murmurs of approval. Daniels knew that optimism was fragile, built on years of distrust, and would only last if followed by concrete, visible actions. After the press conference, the crowd began to disperse slowly, with protesters and reporters filtering away, though the tension in the air remained. Jamal West stood with his family and supporters, talking quietly but with a clear sense of purpose. Chief Daniels walked back into the station, Lieutenant Thompson by his side. Neither spoke at first, both digesting the magnitude of the day's events. "You did well out there, Chief," Thompson finally said, though her voice was tired. She had been battling the storm all day, and it was clear that the real work was only beginning. "But you know this is just a start." Daniels nodded solemnly. "I know. We've got a long road ahead. I'll need your help more than ever." Thompson gave a small nod of agreement. "We'll get through this, but we can't just put out fires anymore. We need to rebuild this department from the inside out, and that's going to take time. And transparency." Daniels sighed heavily, feeling the weight of years of compromise, of letting things slide to keep the peace within the ranks. "I should have seen this coming. I ignored too much for too long, but no more. It's time for real change." Thompson, despite the enormity of the task ahead, gave a faint smile. "Then let's get to work." As the sun set over the city, the events of the day signaled the beginning of something new. The wrongful arrest of Jamal West had sparked a fire that couldn't be extinguished with words alone. It would take action, real accountability, and deep reform to heal the wounds that had been opened. Jamal, now back with his community, knew that this was his moment to push for real change. He had the support of the people, the attention of the nation, and the power of the law behind him. This was more than just his fight now. It was a movement for justice, one that would reshape the city and its police force. And for Chief Daniels, Lieutenant Thompson, and the department, the days ahead would be filled with hard decisions and a reckoning with the past. There would be no more hiding, no more excuses. The future of the city's law enforcement would be written by their actions, and whether they succeeded or failed, the world would be watching. Still, challenges, setbacks, and resistance from some corners of the police department and local government. Not everyone welcomed the changes, and there were officers who resented the new oversight and accountability measures. Some community members were skeptical, having seen promises of reform before, only for those promises to be broken. But despite the hurdles, the city was moving forward step by step. Jamal West, now a central figure in this movement, remained committed to the cause. He had become a symbol of resilience, not just for the black community, but for anyone who had ever felt marginalized or silenced by a system that was supposed to serve them. His work with the Community Justice Initiative, alongside local leaders and activists, was making a real difference. As he met regularly with Lieutenant Thompson and Chief Daniels, Jamal found that there was genuine effort from some in law enforcement to change. Thompson, especially, had proven herself to be a critical ally. She had taken personal responsibility for pushing through reforms within the department, ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. She held officers accountable and demanded that they meet the new standards being set for them. Chief Daniels, on the other hand, while determined, still carried the weight of years of compromise and looking the other way. He was working to regain the trust of both the community and his own officers, but he knew that it would take time. His leadership was under constant scrutiny, not just from his superiors, but from the people he was supposed to serve. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Jamal sat in his office at the Community Justice Initiative, reflecting on how far they had come. The Legal Aid Clinic had successfully defended numerous cases of wrongful arrest and police misconduct, and the Community Oversight Board was starting to gain real traction in holding the department accountable. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Maria Hernandez, the local schoolteacher who had advocated for youth education during their initial meetings, stepped inside. "Jamal," she said, smiling, "we just got word that the educational program is expanding to 3 more schools next month. The kids are responding so well. It's giving them a sense of empowerment they've never had before." Jamal smiled warmly. "That's amazing news, Maria. You've been doing incredible work." Maria sat down across from him. "We've all been doing incredible work, but I wanted to talk to you about something." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking. There's been some pushback from a few members of the community. They're afraid that this movement is going to fizzle out, that the changes we're making won't last once the spotlight moves on. People are worried, Jamal. Jamal nodded slowly, understanding her concern. I've been thinking about that too. The momentum we have right now is strong, but we can't afford to lose focus. We have to keep building, even when the cameras stop rolling and the protests quiet down. Maria leaned forward, her voice soft but urgent. We need to find a way to make these changes permanent, something that can't just be undone when political winds shift. I don't want to see everything we've worked for disappear. Jamal knew she was right. The challenge wasn't just about making changes now. It was about creating a foundation that would ensure those changes lasted. He had seen too many movements rise and fall, too many promises of reform evaporate when the pressure was off. This time, it had to be different. We need to focus on legislation, Jamal said after a moment. We need to work with local and state officials to pass laws that enshrine these reforms, so they can't just be reversed. That's the only way we make sure this sticks. Maria smiled. I knew you'd have a plan. Jamal chuckled softly. It's going to be a long road, but we've already come this far. I'm not stopping now. As Maria left his office, Jamal sat back, thinking about the next phase of the movement. They had built a strong foundation, but now it was time to secure those gains with lasting, systemic change. In the coming weeks, Jamal and his team at the Community Justice Initiative began working with local lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at police reform, community oversight, and legal protections for those who had been wronged by the system. The process was slow, filled with negotiations and pushback, but they were determined to see it through. And slowly but surely, the city began to change, not just in policy, but in spirit. People were more engaged, more willing to speak up, and more willing to hold those in power accountable. There was a renewed sense of community, a belief that things could be better if they worked together. It wasn't perfect. There were still setbacks, still moments of frustration and anger, but there was also progress. And that, Jamal knew, was the key. Because real, lasting change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes everyone. And as long as they kept fighting, kept pushing forward, Jamal believed they could build the future they all deserved. A future where justice, fairness, and dignity weren't just words, but a reality for everyone. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope. And that, Jamal thought, was more powerful than anything else. 6 months after the incident that sparked it all, Jamal West found himself back at the police station. This time, however, he wasn't there as a suspect or a victim, but as a partner. He had been invited to speak at a training session for new recruits, to share his perspective and help shape the next generation of officers. As Jamal walked through the halls, he reflected on how much had changed. The atmosphere in the station felt different. There was still the usual bustle of activity. But now there was also a sense of openness, a willingness to engage that hadn't been there before. Officers greeted him with nods of respect. Some even stopped to shake his hand. It was a small but powerful gesture, a sign that progress was being made. Lieutenant Thompson met him at the door to the training room, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Thank you for coming, Mr. West," she said sincerely. "Your perspective is going to be invaluable for these recruits." Jamal shook her hand, smiling back. "I'm glad to be here, and please call me Jamal." As they entered the room, Jamal saw rows of young recruits looking up at him. Some seemed curious, others a bit hesitant. He understood their wariness. He represented a challenge to the traditional way things had been done, but he also saw potential in their eyes. This was the next generation of officers, and they were open to learning, to doing things differently. "Good morning," Jamal began, his voice steady. "My name is Jamal West, and I'm here to talk to you about justice. Not just the kind of justice you'll be sworn to uphold, but the kind of justice that goes beyond badges and courtrooms. The kind of justice that's about treating every person you encounter with dignity and respect." As he spoke, sharing his experiences and insights, Jamal could see the recruits listening closely. They asked thoughtful questions, engaged in respectful debate, and seemed genuinely interested in learning how to be better officers. It was a promising sign. After the session, as Jamal gathered his notes, one of the recruits approached him. She was young, barely out of her teens, with a look of determination in her eyes. "Mr. West," she began, her voice a little hesitant, "I just wanted to thank you for coming today. I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference, to help people. But after everything that's happened, I started to wonder if I made the right choice. Listening to you today reminded me why I'm here." Jamal smiled, touched by her sincerity. "What's your name?" "Sarah Johnson," she replied. "Well, Sarah," Jamal said, "I'm glad you're here. The department needs people like you. People who want to make a difference, who are willing to question and learn. Don't lose that spirit." As Sarah walked away, Jamal felt a renewed sense of hope. It was people like her, young, determined, and open to change, who would ultimately determine whether the reforms they were fighting for would last. Later that evening, Jamal sat in his office at the Community Justice Initiative, reviewing case files and reports. The work was never-ending, but he found it deeply fulfilling. Every small victory, every life improved, made the long hours and sleepless nights worthwhile. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Maria Hernandez, the teacher who had been instrumental in developing their educational programs, stepped inside, her face lit with excitement. "Jamal," she said, "I just got out of a meeting with the school board. They've approved our curriculum for all high schools in the district." Jamal stood up, his face breaking into a broad smile. "That's fantastic news, Maria. You've worked so hard to make this happen." Maria beamed, but then her expression grew more serious. "It's not just me, Jamal. None of this would be happening without you, without everything you went through." Jamal shook his head. "I may have been a catalyst, but this movement is so much bigger than me. It's about all of us working together to create the change we want to see." As they discussed the curriculum rollout, Jamal felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what real change looked like. Not just speeches or protests, but concrete actions that would shape the future of their community. Later that night, as Jamal headed home, he paused for a moment outside the office. The street was quiet, the city settling into its nighttime rhythm. He thought about how much had changed in the past 6 months and how much work still lay ahead. But as he looked up at the stars twinkling in the clear night sky, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. They were on the right path. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would still be setbacks, moments of tension and resistance. But as long as they kept pushing forward, kept working together, they could build the kind of community they all dreamed of. A community where justice wasn't just a word, but a lived reality for everyone. With renewed determination, Jamal started walking home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, and he was ready to face them one step at a time. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put in a lot of time and effort crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.